Good job. That's hard. All right. It's good to see y'all this morning. I'm going to sit down if that's cool. So this morning we have a passage that is really interesting. It's one that I don't know if we're super familiar with it, or I'm not as familiar with it as I was the crossing the Red Sea, for instance, but it's very similar. But before we kind of dive into the passage this morning, I just want to talk about an idea real quick of a question. But I think before I get into the question, I think we could all attest to, or if you can think of a time where maybe you had not seen someone for a long time, and then you saw them after many years, and they were quite different. How many of you ever had that experience? Or maybe you had seen someone that was like a small child, and then like you saw them like 15 years later, and it's like, wow, you look a lot different, right? And there's probably a lot of things about that person that has changed, not just like looks, right? So like for me, when I was like in the 6th grade, I was 5'6", now I'm 5'7". So, So yeah. So there's a lot of things about us that will change over time. And it's not just physical things, but I think it's also like our character, the things we care about. And this is something that I think each of us individually go through, right? And so I want to begin with a question this morning of who are you becoming? Who are you becoming? And I think this is an interesting question because you have to kind of think through, like, it's very hard to think about this because it happens so slowly, but when you finally realize it, it's almost hard to, like, realize that it's happened, right? So, like, when you think about who you're becoming, for instance, think about, like, this next week. By next Sunday, you will become more of something or somebody. Something about you will change within even the next week that will kind of like mold who you are as a person. And for us, as we're meeting like this morning, like as followers of Jesus, right? And so this is what I think is true. I think that who we are becoming reflects something about us, right? Who we're becoming over the course of time, it reflects something about who we are, right? And this is what I think it reflects. I think it reflects what we trust, like what we're holding on to. So the thing that you trust is usually what you kind of hold on to for hope, right? Like it could be money, stability in a relationship, it could be a job, it could be like comfortability in your life, whatever it may be. There's a number of different things, but what you trust is what it is that you're holding on to, and it also reflects what we're devoted to. And what you're devoted to is simply how you spend your time, where you invest your life. What are you placing your devotion and your time and your life into? And so that question of who are you becoming, and who you're becoming reflects something about you. I think who you're becoming, it reflects what we trust and what we hold on to and what we're devoted to, right? And kind of what I want us to think through is if we're followers of Jesus, right? If we're followers of Jesus and we want to do that well, we want to be good followers of Jesus, right? That's my hope, is that I would look like someone that is continually trying to become more like Jesus, following in the way of Jesus, having faith in like the God that we worship, right? If we're people who desire to follow Jesus well, this ought to be a question that our hearts are open to. The question of, who am I becoming? Who am I becoming? Who am I going to be a week from now differently than I am today? And it can be negative, or it can be positive. It can be a number of things. You can move in the direction of positive and not be impacted by Jesus at all, right? So, like, we are becoming people. And I really like this quote by Dallas Willard, and it's about, like, reflecting actions and based on, like, what you believe, right? We don't believe something by merely saying we believe it, right? Or even when we believe that we believe it. We believe something when we act as if it were true. We believe something when we act as if it were true, right? We believe something when we act as if it's true. Here's an example. If you go skydiving, I don't know why you would ever do that. That sounds horrible. But you do that, and you jump out of that plane because you believe the parachute's going to work. You don't just stand there and say, well, I believe the parachute's going to work. You do it, right? So this quote speaks to who we're becoming is reflective in like what we're trusting, what we're devoted to. And when we say we are followers of Jesus, it won't just be by our words, or it'll be by our actions. And there are many moments in like the scriptures that we can look to. Like if you've been reading through the story, the scriptures that we've been reading through this year, there are many moments in the scriptures that embody actions that reflect devotion and trust to God. There's also many moments in the scriptures that embody like no trust and no devotion to God. So in Numbers, when we walked through the book of Numbers, there's like 7 rebellions of the Israelite people in the book of Numbers where they are just like not having it. They're in the wilderness. They're not trusting God. They've been delivered from the Egyptian people, and they find themselves continue complaining and grumbling. Do y'all remember these stories where they continue complaining and grumbling about like, we don't have water to eat. We might as well have just stayed in Egypt. At least there's like figs and fruit and all these things. And so for some moments in the scriptures we see where there's not this like devotion and this trust, but there are many moments, and I think the passage that we're going to look at today, it embodies and reflects an individual and a group of people who have become people who have faith and devotion and trust to their God. It's a moment in the story of God where there is this devotion and trust, and it's in this story or this moment we're going to look at today. So let's get into it. So I'm going to show a map. Hopefully you can see it well. Okay, so we're going to do a little geography. So this is the area in which the Israelite people were in. And I'll get up and kind of try and point. I'll jump. So this little dot here above the plains of Moab, so here's the Dead Sea. They are at Shittim. It's Shittim, not right? So it's Shittim, if you're wondering how to pronounce that. So they are here, and they are waiting to go into this promised land that God has given them. So this is through the covenant that God has given the Israelite people through Abraham, through Isaac, through Jacob. And this was something that Moses got the opportunity to participate in. But like I mentioned in Numbers, there's these 7 rebellions. And one of the last rebellions is that Moses sends 12 spies into the land. He sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan, and they come back, and 10 of the spies are like, we can't do it, dude. Like, these guys, we can't touch them. We're not going in. So the Israelite people refuse to go into this land that has been promised. They don't have this faith. They don't have this devotion. They don't live in action that reflects trust in God. And so what has happened is that the first generation of Israel, they're forbidden to enter into the promised land. If you want to read this, and I didn't want to list a bunch of verses, but Numbers 14, God basically says, all of you will die, and until the very last one of this generation dies, your children will not be allowed to enter into the promised land. So this time period goes by, and what's interesting about the movement from Mount Sinai, where they're given the law and the promised land, is really just like a 2-week journey on foot. But because of their disobedience and their refusal to trust God, it takes 40 years. The 2-week journey takes 40 years. So they're forbidden to go into the land. Joshua is then given leadership in Joshua chapter 1. We see where Joshua is given this leadership after Moses dies. And Joshua presents this strong leader, this leader that is faithful, this leader that trusts God. He was one of the spies that comes back and says, we can do this. Our God is with us. We can go into this land and we can defeat all those ites, the Canaanites. We can go in there. And then then Joshua then reflects this, and he then sends 2 spies himself. And these 2 spies are sent, and the land of Canaan is viewed by these spies. They come back and they say, we can do this. Let us go into this land that was promised through covenant by our God to Abraham, to Isaac, to Jacob. This is our land. This is where we are going. We trust our God. Let's do this. So they are reflecting devotion and trust to their God. And in this passage, this long passage, I don't want to read through every single part of it, but there are 3, I think, observations that we can look at in this passage that I think we can take note of and be reminders of our relationship with God, who we are becoming as people, and maybe what it looks like for us to look at stories like this and take them and put them into our own lives, right? So the first thing is this. There is faithful action from Joshua and Israel. The first thing that we see in this passage is this faithful action, and we'll read through a few of the verses. Joshua 3, 5 through 6, it says, Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves. And to consecrate was simply to be prepared. Be prepared for God to do something. In Exodus 19, there's actually another instruction where Moses tells the people to consecrate yourselves, and simply all they did was they would wash themselves and cleanse themselves and be prepared for God, because they treated God as holy and they wanted to be cleansed so that they could be a part of what God was about to do. So Joshua told the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow the Lord will do amazing things. There's this attitude of Joshua where he's trusting God. He says, the Lord will do amazing things among you. Joshua then says to the priests, take up the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant, how many of y'all see Indiana Jones? Right? So the Ark of the Covenant kind of looks like that. It's this symbol that carries the presence of God. It represents that the presence of God is with the Israelite people. And so take up the Ark of the Covenant and pass on ahead of the people. And so they took it up, and they went ahead of them. What we see is that Joshua's attitude and Israel's actions reflect faith. They're trusting. In Numbers, we saw the first generation that doesn't get in to enter in, they probably would have been like, we ain't doing this. We're not going. But what this generation did is, and what Joshua does, is they have this trust, this faithful trust and devotion to their God. And Joshua takes serious what God has instructed. He goes to the people and says, prepare yourselves. The Lord will do amazing things today. And the Israelites, they follow Joshua's instructions. The second generation is much more faithful than the first. And what we see is that this faithful action from Joshua and Israel. The first thing that we see in this kind of passage is that they initially have this faithful action from Joshua and Israel. The second thing that we see is God's leading calls Israel into trust. Right? So it's calling them into trusting God. Like they can, like that quote earlier, we say we believe something not by just believing it or saying it, but by doing it. And what we see in this story is that the people of Israel, they believe that their God is with them. Joshua believes that God is going to do amazing things, but only by them stepping into the faith and following God will they see it happen. And in Joshua 3, 9 through 11, it says this, Joshua said to the Israelites, come here and listen to the words of the Lord your God. This is how you will know that the living God is among you, and that he will certainly drive out before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, and the Jebusites. See, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth will go into the Jordan ahead of you. Something that is interesting is that early on when the ark of the covenant is made, there's this requirement of about I think it's 2,000 or 20,000 cubits of length that people must be distant from the Ark of the Covenant. It's roughly half a mile. So there's this, literally, what they have to do is they're carrying this ark, and the people of Israel are half a mile behind. And I think that's so interesting because it's if you're following something, you have to let it be ahead of you. If you're following after something, you can't be ahead of it, right? And so this instruction from Joshua we see is that the Ark of the Covenant goes ahead of them, and there's this literal need for them to follow behind, not just because it is God leading them, but if they get too close, it'll also kill them. And so what we see is that the Ark of the Covenant is being carried by the Israelite priests. The Israelites are following after it, and the people of Israel, they had full belief that their God was with them. How do we know that? Because they follow after this presence of God. They go after this ark that's following ahead of them. And the people of Israel, they have this belief and this trust that their God is with them, and it goes forward. And the last kind of thing that we see in this passage is that there's provision from God. That there is ultimately provision from God in this moment, in this story. In Joshua 3, 14 through 17 is kind of the climax of this passage where we see God provide. We've seen the trust of Joshua. We have seen the trust of the Israelite people. We've seen them step into faith, follow after this presence of God where they're literally having to follow. They're not even able to get ahead of it. So they're being led by God. And then we see this. So when the people broke camp to cross the Jordan, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant went ahead of them. Now, the Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. And I didn't have photos of this, but I looked at some, and you ain't crossing over by foot, right? It's flooded. The Jordan is at flood stage all during the harvest. Yet as soon as the priests who carried the ark reached the Jordan and their feet touched the water's edge, the water from upstream stopped flowing. Have y'all ever, stepped in a creek that's, flowing water or river, and it's you kind of got to stand, it's strong. And the Jordan River is pretty strong. And so there is this literal flowing water. And it says it piles up in a heap a great distance away at a town called Adam in the vicinity of Zarethan, while the water flowing down to the sea of Arabah, that is the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. The priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stopped in the middle of the Jordan and stood on dry ground, while all Israel passed by until the whole nation had completed the crossing on dry ground. So we see God's provision in this moment. We've seen the faith of Joshua. We've seen the faith of Israel. We've seen Israel step into trust of God, not just by saying that they believe, by truly following. They follow this ark, this presence of God, up to the Jordan. And then what we see is the instructions of them is to step into the water, go into the water. And what we saw in Exodus, we saw a staff, and God provided through splitting the sea. But what we see here is in a similar way, God tells them to step into the water, into this flowing water, and it begins to pile up in a heap. Like there's this up the way, the water just stops. And this ground becomes dry, and the Israelite people see God provide for them. They see God deliver them into this land that was promised. They see God do what he had said he would do for generations before, but what it took was not just belief or saying that they believed, but what it took was stepping into obedience, stepping into following God. And what we see is that Joshua and these Israelite people over the course of time have become people who were able to live in faith, in devotion, and trust in God. God's provision came as Israel was open and obedient to the instruction of God. Over the course of time, 40 years is a long time, right? Over the course of time, they became people who were faithful. They became people who were faithful. And what we see in this story is we see the difference. There's this duality of the first generation of Israel where they're complaining and grumbling and disobedient. And even Moses gets so frustrated to a point where he's not even able to enter into this land. He has seen God move. He's seen God perform. He's seen the plagues. He's seen the Red Sea split. He's seen all of these things in the first group. They don't even get to enter in. And then we see this second group. Over the course of time, they become people who are faithful, they're obedient, and it's not just obedience and belief by like words, but we see them step into this and follow the Ark of the Covenant, the presence of God, to the Jordan, and they're able to cross on dry land into this land that God had promised because they trusted and believed the covenant that God had given to Israel would be completed, even if it didn't seem possible. And see, this moment in the story of God reflects those who had become people whose actions reflected trust and devotion. Over the course of time, we're becoming something. We're becoming like someone. There are things that are shaping us, and the things that shape us often reflect like what we're giving our devotion to and what we're giving our trust to. And for the Israelite people, they had over the course of time become people that were able to live out in trust and obedience and live into what God had called them to. Not only was this like a huge moment for them just being provided this land, but they had finally stepped into the identity that God had called them to be, his children of his covenant, and he wanted to provide them this land because it was promised. And this covenant that God gave them, they stepped into by their faith because they had become people over time who reflected faith and trust and devotion to God. And the question that I want to ask, like, for you this morning, as we think about, like, who am I becoming? What is shaping me? Are we becoming people that reflect a similar trust and devotion? Are we becoming people who reflect a similar trust and devotion? What is the thing that you trust in? What is the thing you hold to tightly? The thing that if you lost it, your world would fall apart, right? What are you devoted to? Where do you invest your time? Where do you place your hope? Where are you investing your life, right? That is what shapes us. What are the things that are shaping you? And are they drawing you towards living this reflective faith? Because Joshua and Israel, they lived this reflective faith. They lived this faith that shows devotion and trust to their God, trusting that their God would deliver. And they didn't just believe it, but they stepped into it, and it happened. They're able to cross on dry ground. 1 John 2:6 for us, it says this: whoever claims to live in him must live as Jesus did. We're called to live after Jesus, follow after Jesus, and this person Jesus is the way of life that he offers us, is one that we are invited to step into. And when we think about what is shaping us, my hope is that it would be Jesus. My hope is that Jesus would be shaping our actions, would be shaping our love, would be shaping our life, that our devotion would be to him, our trust would be in him, and over the course of time, we would be people who have this reflective faith of devotion and trust to the way of Jesus. And so when I was thinking through this, and thinking through that first question of who am I becoming, I had to think about who do I want to be? Who am I becoming? Who will I become next week, next Sunday? Who will I be a little bit more of? And what I wanted to do is I just wrote out a short prayer. I wrote out a short prayer because I wanted to give you something that if you want to write it down or take a picture of it, that maybe it can be helpful for you in this week. And when you think about who are you becoming, it's this prayer right here. May I become someone being shaped by my remembrance of Jesus and by my trust in his way. God, help me to lay aside what I often allow to shape my life that draws me away from a life that reflects devotion and trust to you. And this is the prayer that I hope that we would pray for our lives, that we would be people who become more like Jesus, that we would follow after Jesus. And it wouldn't just be by like believing we believe it or like thinking we believe it, but we would live as if we believed it. Just like when you jump out of a plane, you believe that parachute is going to save you, and so you do it. If you believe in the way of Jesus, we have to live like it. We have to reflect it. And much like Israel, we're invited to be obedient to Jesus and his way of life. And the question is whether we will do that or not. And so this is the prayer that I hope maybe you could pray for yourself, for your families, in your own life, that over the course of time, who we become looks more like Jesus than ourselves and more like Jesus than the things that are shaping us. And this is what we're called to lay down our lives. And Jesus even says that. He says, I've come to give you a life to lay down. And so this morning, as we move into a time of worship, reflect on that. What is it that you are becoming? Who will you be more of 5 years from now? Who will you be more of a week from now? Who are you becoming more like Jesus? Are you reflecting that in your life, in your faith, in the way you live? I'll pray, and then we'll move into a time of worship. I want to invite you, as we move into worship, we have the offering basket here. If you would like to come forward as a part of worship and give a tithe to God, you can do that. Dean and I will be here to the sides. And if you would like to come pray with one of us, you are more than welcome to do that. But at this time, we want to really allow God to move in our hearts and be challenged by the question of who are we becoming? What is shaping us? And who do we want to be? My hope is that it would look like Jesus. All right? Let's pray. Dear God, thank you for your love and your mercy, God. I just pray that we would be trusting in who you are, trusting in your mercy and your goodness, God. I pray that you would show us continually who you want us to be. I pray that we would reflect on who we're becoming, and if that's not like you, then I pray that we would turn from that. Jesus, we thank you for everything that you're doing. In your name I pray. Amen.